President of the United States has revealed top-secret classified information to Russia. According to the Post, Trump shared the classified information with the Russian ambassador and the Russian foreign minister at the White House last week. This information involved ISIS. The report states it jeopardized a critical source of intelligence. And we are awaiting a briefing from the National Security Advisor at those cameras momentarily. The White House now in full denial mode. The Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy, Dina Powell, saying tonight the story is false. The president only discussed the common threats that both countries faced. Of course, the Russian ambassador is believed by U.S. intelligence to be a top Russian spy and spy recruiter. Sarah Murray begins our coverage out front at the White House as we await H.R. McMaster approaching those cameras and speaking to the press. The minute that happens, we'll bring you there live. Sarah, I know you're just feet away. What are you learning?
Well, Aaron, we are looking for a fuller explanation from the president's national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, on exactly what happened but in this meeting between President Trump and Russia's foreign minister, as well as Russia's ambassador. That's where the Washington Post is reporting that the president apparently shared classified information. Now, the White House has been scrambling for the last, I would say, hour or so to figure out how they're going to respond to this. They responded by putting a trio of statements out from some of their officials, and they don't all say the same thing, Aaron. And as you pointed out, there is a statement from Dina Powell, a deputy national security advisor, that flat out says this story is false. But it's worth noting that the White House also put out statements from Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, as well as National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster already. Those statements don't go that far. They do not say the story is flat out false. Let me read you what H.R. McMaster said in his statement. The president and the foreign minister reviewed common threats from terrorist organizations to include threats to aviation. At no time were any intelligence sources or methods discussed, and no military operations were disclosed that were not already known publicly. So not a flat-out denial that the story is false. And Aaron, just one more point of fact-checking here. The Washington Post report, they broke this story about what the president said to these Russian officials, does not say that he discussed sources and methods, but it does say that he disclosed classified information, clearly the kind of classified information that was very alarming when U.S. officials found out about it. And obviously we're waiting to get more details on this sort of discrepancy we're seeing in these statements from H.R. McMaster when he begins speaking.
All right, Sarah, thank you very much. And the Washington Post reporter who broke the story is going to be with me in just a moment because there are some crucial details here in this story. I want to go to the Pentagon now, though, for the response. Barbara Starr is there. And Barbara, do we at this time know what it is that the president revealed?
Well, according to the Washington Post, and I'll leave it to the reporter you have to explain it further, some of this did have to do, in fact, with intelligence that perhaps led to the ban on laptops on board passenger cabins in airplanes. So it's quite interesting that that statement referenced aviation. You could talk about that with the Russians, certainly. Nobody wants to see Russian passenger liners crash due to some intelligence threat they may not be aware of. But the Post article clearly suggesting that the president shared some of the most sensitive intelligence information about this, and that information came from another country, and that is the key problem. When you get intelligence from another country, you can't share it with somebody else. It's very sensitive. It's very confidential. There's no expectation that you're going to share it with another country. Countries want to know that they can tell the U.S. things, that they can tell the president, the CIA, and that information will be kept confidential, because if it is shared, it puts their own people, this other country that we don't know who it is, it potentially puts their people, their intelligence gathering systems, all of that at risk on the ground in very dangerous places around the world. It jeopardizes their safety, their ability to operate, and what happens is they don't want to share with the United States anymore. So there's going to be a real question here about whether some confidence has been shaken in intelligence services around the world.
All right, Barbara, thank you very much. And I want to get to the reporter who broke the story, Greg Miller, national security correspondent for the Washington Post. My whole panel is with me. I want to introduce all of you. Then we're going to start with Greg. Bob Baer is here, former CIA, Julia Kayyem, former Homeland Security, Mark Preston, political analyst, Alan Dershowitz, Harvard Law professor emeritus, and Jim Sciutto, our chief national security correspondent. So, Greg, let me start with you so you could explain. And I know I want to make sure people understand. You're going to share as much as you can, but not enough to to put lives at risk if that is what you're trying to do, right? You're not going to say the city from where this intelligence operative was able to penetrate top levels of ISIS, for example, to try to protect lives. But tell me how specific, how top secret, what was this information?
So as your other reporter summarized, this was really sensitive information about an ongoing and unfolding Islamic State terror plot that has caused a great deal of concern among counterterrorism officials. And in a conversation with the Russian foreign minister and ambassador, Trump is going into details of what the United States knows about this unfolding plot, how the Islamic State is pursuing it, trying to put it together, trying to pull it off. And at the same time talking about some of the measures the United States is taking to try to deal with it. And this is problematic mainly because this is information the United States has, mainly, if not exclusively, because of a foreign partner providing it that has some access to the Islamic State. And so this wasn't intel that the United States was authorized to share, and especially not authorized to share with Russia.
And I want to read to you, Greg, because this goes to the heart of what you're reporting. Two statements from the White House tonight, one of which came from the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, via the White House, say this. During President Trump's meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov, a broad range of subjects were discussed, among which were common efforts and threats regarding counterterrorism. During that exchange, the nature of specific threats were discussed. Okay, so they admit it. I'm sorry, but they did not discuss sources, methods, or military operations. All right, so let me just ask you specifically, Greg, because in your report, you are saying that while those sources and methods may not have been specifically discussed, by the information the president shared, they would be easily ascertainable, right?
In fact, our story says clearly that the president did not name this partner, the source of this intelligence, did not talk about the particular collection capability that was responsible for this intelligence, but was providing details that came because of this intelligence stream. And the worry among a lot of security officials that we talked to was that Russia, which has very capable intelligence services of its own, could try to reverse engineer this, could try to figure out what is this source the United States has, who is this ally that the United States is depending on, where does this stuff come from. Trump's reference to a specific city may have made that even easier. So that's what the concern is about.
And Greg, you continue, there's one sentence in your story. You write, Moscow would be keenly interested in identifying that source and possibly disrupting it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so the relationship with Russia and Syria is so problematic, right? I mean, on the one hand, the United States and Russia both regard the Islamic State as a threat and want to deal with that threat and probably collaborate or cooperate to some degree in sharing information about that might protect Russians or might protect Americans from attack.
Greg, I interrupt just to listen to the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. Everyone, here he is.
There's nothing that the president takes more seriously than the security of the American people. The story that came out tonight, as reported, is false. The president and the foreign minister reviewed a range of common threats to our two countries, including threats to civil aviation. At no time were intelligence sources or methods discussed. And the president did not disclose any military operations that were not already publicly known. Two other senior officials who were present, including the Secretary of State, remember the meeting the same way and have said so. Their on-the-record accounts should outweigh those of anonymous sources. And I was in the room. It didn't happen. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
So, Greg, let me just go to you first, okay, because I want to give you a chance. I want to make it clear here. He's saying your story is false and no sources and methods were disclosed, but I want to be loud and clear here. Your story does not say sources and methods were disclosed. It says a specific plot was discussed from which one would be able to figure out sources and methods. Am I correct?
I think that's right, and I think that the White House is playing word games here to that effect to try to blunt the impact of this story. Nor do any of these White House officials who are denouncing this story, nor have any of them offered any explanation why, if this was also above board and not problematic in any way, why did the National Security Council, coming out of this meeting, feel it was necessary to contact the CIA director and the director of the National Security Agency to give them a heads up on what Trump had just told the Russians?
Right, so the bottom line is you stand by this story on every word of it. He says it's false. You say no.
Absolutely.
All right, please stay with me. All of you stay with me. I just want to go to our justice correspondent, Evan Perez. Evan, Greg couldn't be clearer.
Well, yeah, Aaron, and I got to tell you, the words that that H.R. McMaster just spoke really does not really contradict Greg's story in the Washington Post report. And look, we know from experience, because we reported back on March 31st about the intelligence that was behind the laptop ban, and we spent a couple of days doing conference calls with the U.S. Intelligence agencies, and they were specifically concerned about the aspects that Greg was pointing out in this story, the things that the president allegedly told the Russian officials in the Oval Office there during that meeting are exactly the things that we were asked to keep out of the story, because we were told that if we reported those things, it would tell the enemy about the sources of methods, the way in which the U.S. had gathered this information, and its allies had gathered this information. So really what we're talking about is you don't necessarily need to say, you know, a specific... This is how we got it, yeah. This is how we got it, but just the use of certain words and certain aspects, details of the story, we were told that we should hold back, and we did, because we felt that there was no interest for us to help the enemy and help terrorist organizations, you know, get through the security system here in the United States or around the world. So we held back a lot of those details, and now apparently, according to Greg's reporting, it appears the president just kind of let that out in his meeting with the Russian officials.
So Greg, let me just ask you, in terms of the detail, obviously you said it was a looming threat that he was giving details about, and just could you give me a little bit more information? He was walking through all sorts of scenarios related to this laptop bomb. I mean, what was it that he was sharing?
Yeah, I want to be clear here. So sources that we talked to were really worried about, they didn't want to compound the problem here, so they were withholding details from us, and then we are withholding even further details from our stories at the request of officials that we talked to all day today.
Right, such as, I'm just to interrupt, just such as you're withholding the name of the city so that ISIS wouldn't theoretically be able to know, well, it's someone had infiltrated their top levels in a specific city.
Correct.
That's just one thing. Anyway, go ahead.
Correct. And so, I mean, so we're withholding some of that information, but what Trump, but we know more about what Trump talked about in this session, and the way it was described to us was he was laying out sort of details about the capability here, how the Islamic State is pursuing this plot, how it's going about developing it, how it's attempting what it's putting in place to try to pull it off, talking about situations in which it might have greater impact or lesser impact, under which circumstances. In other words, if it happened in this kind of case, we could expect a big problem, many casualties possibly, or in other cases it might be more muted and not as effective. I mean, he's revealing stuff that is coming largely from this really important intelligence stream.
Now, Greg, from your reporting, did the president have any idea what he was doing? I mean, he is in a meeting with the foreign minister of Russia and, of course, Sergei Kislyak, the ambassador, who's controversial, and we have reported is believed to be not only a Russian spy, but a top Russian recruiter of spies in this country. Do you have any knowledge as to the president knowing that he was sharing this information that was so verboten?
Well, I think that, you know, there's a couple things there. So a couple of my colleagues described this meeting with Kislyak and Lavrov as inopportune at best, right? I mean, so it's one day after he's fired the FBI director. Trump is admitting that that was partly because of his frustration with the FBI's inquiry into Russia and the Trump campaign. Then he's greeting the Russian ambassador and foreign minister at the White House and having this lengthy conversation with them. And so, I mean, it's just problematic on so many levels. Other officials that we talked to, and we include this in the story as well, expressed frustration with a lack of discipline for the president. So they prepare pages of talking points, try to prepare him going into meetings like this. This is what we should discuss. This is what we need to talk about. This is what you can expect them to try to raise. Trump has insisted that those be boiled down to a single page of bullet points that he can digest, and often even strays from those.
And you also report in a sense that some of this was bragging.
Yeah, I mean, the White House hasn't disputed any of that language, nor did anybody that we talked to today. That he launches into this subject by saying, I get the best intel, I got the great intel, I get great briefings every day, you got to believe this. And wraps it up, this whole part of the conversation, by saying, can you believe the world we live in?
So, I mean, the bottom line here seems to be that they're saying your story is false, but they're saying that you're saying something you're not saying at all. I mean, that's sort of the conclusion that I'm reaching here, Greg, right?
And that's a sort of classic ploy.
Okay, so yeah. Let me, Jim, I've got Jim Sciutto here as well. Jim, I mean, here's the reality. Greg's reporting would indicate that what H.R. McMaster just said, this story is false. What Dina Powell is saying, the Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy, came out and said this story is false. Those two statements are untrue.
His statement is fundamentally insufficient because the Washington H.R. McMaster, and frankly all the statements, because the Washington Post story says that the president revealed classified information resulting from a secret source, not that it revealed who that secret source was. Now, in the world of intelligence, oftentimes you can make conclusions about who the source is based on where it's coming from. That's the thing, as Greg was saying, to reverse engineer it. That's one point I would make. Second point I would make, if the White House had demonstrated credibility on any, certainly intelligence issue, but any of the other many controversies that have come out.
Of trusting the statements that come
from the White House podium or senior officials, you might be inclined to give this statement more. I'm just stating an obvious fact. You might be inclined to give this statement more credibility than it has. Two other points I would make. One, I mean, there are really three things that I've been speaking to intelligence officials, current and former, all day as the ripples of this go out. They make 3 points to me about why, if this is confirmed, it would be significant. One, the obvious point, it's classified information. Two, revealed to a prime adversary of the U.S., Russia. And three, that it gets to a sensitive relationship. It's difficult to build these relationships. The U.S. has many intelligence sharing relationships with countries that are natural.
This country has agents' lives at risk at this moment, in the field, in the middle of ISIS.
And we have relationships that are intelligence sharing that are public. Britain, France, Germany, etc., the Five Eyes, which includes Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Then we have other relationships that are more sensitive, built over time, more comfortable, more uncomfortable, rather, for those involved. The final point I would make is this. If this relates to the laptop ban, and there's a lot, we're talking about aviation risks, even McMaster referenced aviation risks. Let me just tell you, this is an extremely hot threat right now in the view of U.S. intelligence and counterterror. There is a debate going on right now about banning laptops, not just from these 8 Muslim-majority countries, but from Europe, even talk on U.S. airlines. This is this is a clear and present danger. You were talking about the most urgent terror threat to the U.S.
So Greg, let me ask you, from the people you spoke to, when you were first told... Greg is not there? Okay, sorry, as we get him back, let me just go to you, Julia Keim, and ask you this question, because we understand from Greg's reporting, right, that the president walked through various scenarios. He was saying some with mass casualties when he was talking about this laptop bomb, with the information that he had. Does this information that he shared, because he shared it with the Russians, put lives at risk? Lives of the agents whose lives are on the line infiltrating ISIS, and lives of regular civilians who could be on an airplane that, because this source somehow ends up being put out of commission, are now at greater risk?
Yes. The short answer is yes. You know, we have a tendency to say that was dangerous what the president did, or it could risk lives. This literally was disclosed in the middle of one of the most serious intelligence debates going on in government right now. We've heard pieces of it regarding the laptop ban, but it regards the extent to which ISIS, and to be honest, until this story, I didn't know it was ISIS we were talking about. There were actually questions whether there were other terrorist groups trying to do this. The extent to which ISIS had the capability to essentially get a laptop bomb near the skin of an airplane in the air and kill hundreds of people. So we have a limited laptop ban going on now. There was rumors last year that we reported on in CNN that would be extended to Europe. It was sort of put on hold. No one knew why. And so this is not some historic issue. This is the headlines, and the Washington Post story seems remarkably legitimate and timely at this stage.
Bob Baer, how serious is this?
It's extremely serious. As Juliet said, these bombs are chemical explosions. They can reach full detonation. With a suicide bomber on an airplane, you can take down any airplane. There's no way to detect them with X-rays, which you can detect nitrates, normal explosives. This is an innovation that the Islamic State has taken beyond our wildest imagination. And the only way we can actually stop these plots is to keep running sources inside the Islamic State. And the president, by revealing this to the Russians, has lost control of this information. It's going to go to the Syrians. It's going to go to the Iranians, Russian allies. And the ability to protect that source, whoever he is, wherever he is, has been seriously undermined. And I can tell you this, if a CIA officer had revealed this information to the Russians, he'd be fired instantly.
Fired instantly. That will not happen. to the President of the United States because he can declassify whatever he wants. But that doesn't change the seriousness or perhaps the lack of judgment that was just shown.
Well, this is worse than criminal. It's not criminal because the president can declassify. It doesn't violate the espionage law because it says material that basically shouldn't have gotten to another side. So he's safe from criminal investigation. He's probably safe from impeachment. But the worst case scenario here is this is Jordanian intelligence or Israeli intelligence. They got a guy after years who was on the inside. This guy is now going to get killed. The information gets to Hezbollah. It gets to Iran. It gets to all of America's enemies. Now, we learned one new thing tonight from the Washington Post reporter. We learned that the leak didn't come from Russia. We learned that the leak came from an American source. Why? Here's what he says. He says the source didn't want to compound the problem. Right. He's telling us he may not have wanted to, but he's telling us something that's important, that the leak came from an American source. So there's an American intelligence source who is loyal to the United States, who feels that the president did something so bad that he is prepared to go to the Washington Post and perhaps even in some ways compound the problem because he thinks on balance he has an obligation to do that.
Which is crucial because some people, Jim, watching may say this is compounding the problem. Okay, the Washington Post is refraining from publishing the city, for example, where this intelligence operative may have penetrated ISIS. ISIS can figure it out. Russia can figure it out. That's the whole point of the story. What is this balance that this person leaking would have felt it was so important to share?
To share that there are lives at risk here, right? Because for a moment we have
from this person's point of view, whether we know or not in the press, or you watching know, the Russians are going to tell the Iranians, ISIS is going to know. And all these lives could be at risk anyway.
Relationship damaged, and the value of that relationship, right? Because this is intelligence, it seems, related to the most current terror threat to the U.S. Great concern about aviation threats. And this is another point I would make. At some point, we have to separate from, does this damage the president? What is the risk to the president? It seems to be a clear and present risk to lives here. Senator Blumenthal, member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, made that very point. Yeah. That's what, to a key intelligent relationship, and to the response to and prevention of the most immediate terror threat.
So Senator Blumenthal is going to be with us in just a couple of moments. Let me just ask you, though, Mark Preston, about the questions this raises. Does this raise questions about the president's competence? I just go to the Washington Post report where Greg wrote and quoted a former official saying, does he understand what's classified and what's not? That's what worries me.
Yeah, well, and let me put it in two different veins. The geopolitical vein right now, you are looking at about 12:23 a.m. in London. You're looking at about 2:23 a.m. in Tel Aviv. To think that the head of those intelligence agencies for those countries who are big allies, strong allies of the United States, have not been roused from their beds to be told what is going on right now as we speak here in Washington, D.C., we'd be foolish. And that comes to the question of competency and trust. And can they trust, as Jim Sciutto was saying right there, talking about relationships, can they trust giving President Trump information? I also think it's telling here, when you look at the electoral political fallout, is that you have Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, saying that he wants to get a full account of the facts from the administration. At the same time, you're not seeing any senators, any Republicans who are rushing to the defense of Donald Trump. They're being a little bit more careful and taking a step back. I think that is very telling.
Very telling, because, Mark, part of the issue is they're coming out and saying the story is false, but what they're saying is false isn't what the Washington Post reported. And unfortunately, as we've seen even in their rendition of what happened with Jim Comey, what they all came out and said ended up being completely untrue. So people, whether it be Republicans in Congress or people watching tonight, don't know whether to trust them or whether they're lying.
There's been so many opportunities in the past where Republicans have walked out on a limb or they have defended President Trump on quite frankly, silly aspects, whether it's crowd size for his inaugurations or what have you. This is no longer silly. This is very, very serious.
This is indefensible. Nobody can defend. And nobody will defend the president on this. They may say it's untrue. But if it's true, he will get no defense on this.
Juliet.
Aaron, can I just, So in the world of counterterrorism, when a terrorist organization thinks that there's someone near them who may know something, so first of all, that person, if it's actually a human asset that has gotten close to ISIS and they're planning, that person is likely dead. I'm just being blunt here. But let me just talk. So what happens when a terrorist organization thinks it's been compromised? Two things. One is they postpone what they were planning, which would be great, or they speed it up. And so all of our concern about what's going on here is there is a tendency when an organization is compromised that they actually move faster to avoid detection. And so we are probably entering a more heightened sort of concern time because of the fact that we now know, but the Russians knew a couple days ago, that someone or something, some intelligence was exploited.
Bob Baer, what do you make of the point that Juliet's saying? They either slow it down, okay, or they speed it up. And by the way, just to remind everybody, that's what we saw, for example, in the Brussels attacks at the airport, right? They thought they were onto them, and they went ahead and did that before they